Schafer, .NET enthusiast, a developer. I like to stay up to date with the latest technologies. And yeah, I've recently been playing around with Blazor, and I have a talk.
This is the second time you've given this presentation, right?
Yes, this is the second time.
Anybody else been to this presentation at Smart Data? Two, three.
Excellent. It should be very similar, but I have done some new things around it and played with some of the latest versions, so hopefully there's enough new information. All right. So Blazor comes from Browser and Razor. It's a C# framework. They jokingly put this image as a potential mascot in one of their repos just as a joke, and I thought it was kind of funny, so I threw it in here. That's the .NET mascot robot thing, and they just put a purple Blazor on him. So Blazor is it's a .NET framework that runs on WebAssembly. It's built to give a single-page application kind of feel, very similar to a lot of the JavaScript single-page application frameworks. I'll be going into all of these in more detail as we go through the slides. It's built on a component model, it's very experimental, and it's community-driven. So, to start with, what is Blazor not? It is not a plugin. It's not similar to Silverlight. It's something new. It's much more web standard friendly and focused on it's the right side of the web. It's standard driven and not something that you're going to be forcing your people who use your application to install something potentially nefarious. It also is not a transpiler. You're writing C#. It does not somehow become JavaScript behind the scenes. It is C# that runs just like any of your other .NET applications. Blazor is built on WebAssembly. This is a standards format that runs bytecode inside the browser. It's run in the same sandbox that JavaScript is to make sure that it can't do anything nefarious on your machines. Behind the scenes, I believe it does become JavaScript in some form when it's running, but ultimately the .NET team has created a .NET runtime built on WebAssembly. So your code is C#, it gets compiled into DLLs. It itself doesn't compile into WebAssembly, but there's a .NET runtime built in WebAssembly that can run the DLLs your app produces. WebAssembly is supported by all the major browsers, and if it's not supported somewhere you need to be, like Internet Explorer, then there's a polyfill available that just runs in JavaScript and can run all the WebAssembly code. So ultimately could run that WebAssembly runtime and your DLLs. So Blazor is a single-page application framework. It's very much inspired by Angular, React, Vue, all the latest players in this space. Steve Sanderson is on the ASP.NET team, and he's kind of been taking the lead on this, and he is infamous for working on Knockout.js. And yeah, it's very great. So Blazor is built with a component module. You build components, and then those components have subcomponents and things like that. This is all powered by Mono. Mono is the open source C# that was around before .NET Core for running C# applications in Linux and things. Blazor's built on Mono because Mono is very client-side focused for the applications it supports. Unity, Xamarin, all those kinds of applications. It has an intermediate language linker that you can target something like system.web or something and only use a very small portion of it, and the IL linker will reduce the size of that DLL to only the parts of it that you're actually using. That's something very convenient for client-side applications where you don't want to send down giant megs full of DLLs to your client through the web to run your thing. You just want the parts that you need, and it strips away anything you don't. So that's why it's built on Mono instead of .NET Core. .NET Core is very good at server-side implementations, and there's server-side things that Blazor takes care of that you can use .NET Core for, but if you're running inside of a browser, it's all built on Mono. In some of the applications I've been building, I've got an application that compares the server side and the client side. Mono's been fairly good for a lot of it, but you occasionally do run into some snags. Just things don't quite work right. I had a system.drawing reference in some of my code, and Mono didn't like that at all. Looking through GitHub issues and things, it seems apparent that that's been an issue for a while. So those are some of the kinds of things you might run into if you're trying to run on the browser. There's also, I've run into a lot of problems with the IL linker where it strips away APIs that I needed or didn't know how to reduce things, so you had to turn that off in some areas. And a lot of times if you go to the Blazor repos to look for help for some issues you run into, you'll see a lot of things where the .NET teams sending the issues over to the Mono teams to work through. They're still working through a lot of that relationship, being reliant on somebody else to provide your framework versus Microsoft just talking to the Microsoft departments. And that's a lot of the reason why this framework is still very experimental and preview. And there's no commitment to Microsoft supporting the client-side version of Blazor at this point in perpetuity. Cool. The component model is built on Net Standard, so it itself can be referenced from .NET Core, and they have provided a server-side implementation of Blazor that I'll go into more detail a little bit later. That's very nice and compelling, but for the most part, it relies on Net Standard 2.0, but if you try to do something like send an email from inside of a browser, you'll get a platform not supported exception for things that just don't make sense for a client-side web app to do. So the component model provides all the basic kind of things that you'd expect from a single-page application. You've got layouts so that you can have a consistent look and feel across your web app. It provides routing, so when you click various buttons and go to different areas of your application, it's not doing a postback or any kind of server request. It just changes to another component for you, but can still give you that rich browser-like feel, so you can have deep links directly to those sections of your application. And if you bookmark a particular page, then you can get back there very quickly. And it provides the same dependency injection framework that at least I love in .NET Core, and that ASP.NET Core has been built on for providing all those dependencies and getting things as you need. The component model, so just because you're a Blazor app and you're using C#, there's still occasionally need for JavaScript. You might pull in some kind of JavaScript library like Bootstrap or something and need to interact with that. Your C# has the ability to call JavaScript functions and vice versa. So you can still leverage all of the web as needed. Also, WebAssembly in its current form, but the spec that it's built around and everything can't interact with the DOM at all. WebAssembly is very small and it's experimental itself and being built out, its features. In the future, I'm sure that'll be possible, but right now, if you want to interact with the DOM, insert some element or something, JavaScript ultimately needs to do that. That's not to say you'll have to write that JavaScript. Likely somebody has already built a Blazor library that could do the thing you're looking to do. But understand there is still JavaScript in your application. It's just you might not be the person who has to write it, which is great if you don't like JavaScript at least. Blazor is experimental, so it's currently a 0.7.0 release. Yeah, and Microsoft said they do not recommend you use it for production applications. They are, I believe, currently working on getting it established for .NET Core 3.0, which is due out later this year, and that will also let it be, the preview versions and things I believe will be built around Visual Studio 2019, which is in preview now. So there's a lot of work in that because it's been experimental and very mono-focused before, and it wasn't a core part of the ASP.NET Core repos and everything. It's been off to the side, and I think they're currently going through incorporating it into the rest of ASP.NET Core.
So just like from what I've read on this is, though it's experimental now, and because of the state of WebAssembly and how they're kind of waiting, like Microsoft is kind of heavily pushing that this is the way forward, or at least in some part this is, I know this kind of answers that question, but I've heard a lot of things saying that Microsoft does want this to be a path forward, at least
yes.
Some version of this. I know server-side Blazor is a big thing that they're pushing, and they eventually want to have this as a potential replacement.
It's been an experiment because they want to gauge interest and see what the community does with something like this, see what people want. There has been a very big interest in it, and that's caused them to now, they have committed to Razor Components, which is the server-side implementation of Blazor that's completely .NET Core and just uses WebSockets and SignalR to communicate changes from the client to the server. That is committed and going to be a part of .NET Core 3. So that is the path forward. And also, it's just a part of ASP.NET. The same way that SignalR is, you just pull in another DLL and you have Blazor along with the MVC or Razor pages that you're currently using. It's incorporated in the product in the same way and tested and everything. The only thing that they haven't committed to right now is the mono-based client-side version of this that relies on WebAssembly. And I think a lot of that's just still working with the mono team to get through some of these issues and establish that working relationship and see, especially now that they've committed to the server side, is that still necessary? Is that something that people are demanding or not? What parts of Blazor is the very important parts, and is it good enough that they're going to provide Razor components, at least potentially? So yes, Razor Components is coming later this year, and that's server-side Blazor. It's .NET Core. It's the same programming model as the client. I actually have examples in my code that I'll show in a second, but to change an app from client-side Blazor to server-side Blazor, it's like 2, maybe 3 lines of code, very, very small differences between the two. So a workflow that they've endorsed and made people aware of is it's hard to debug your C# code running inside of Chrome. They're working on the developer experience and being able to hit breakpoints in that scenario and things, but you can take your code that's running inside a browser now, make those 2 or 3 changes to your code, and then hit breakpoints as it's running on the server right now. And it's very, very simple to do that. And then you're just running in .NET Core instead of mono. Full .NET environment. Yeah, so if you're server-side Blazor, you're going to have a smaller initial download. You don't need to pull down every DLL that your app relies on. But every single time you click a button or whatnot, it's going to be some kind of connection to the server to ask the server, what do I do now? They manage all of that. It's invisible to you. You're just setting up a click handler for that button, and then it deals with when I click this, some JavaScript tells the server it clicked, what do I do, and send it back down. But it's still that communication. You're not going to build a offline portable web app kind of application in server-side Blazor because you absolutely have to have a server there or your app doesn't do anything. So yeah, no offline support. Blazor is very community driven. They've built this core framework with just component model and very, it's a little lightweight. and then the community's rallied behind it for a lot of things. There's a community-driven project for wiring up the iLogger from Microsoft Diagnostics so that it writes to your console window for you. Local storage canvas. There's a community SignalR client, so that I experimented with a little game. It's very nice, but it feels just like the JavaScript SignalR, but you don't need to write the JavaScript to communicate to the hub. You write it in C#. And then very recently, Telerik has announced that all of their Kendo controls, they're porting over to Blazor. So you can just write them with Blazor components instead of the typical HTML helpers and tag helpers that they've been putting out for quite a while. So community's definitely rallying behind it, and I think it's got a bright future. As long as that's where the developers want to be, then I'm sure Microsoft will support it. So recently, some of the recent stuff they've worked on, there is a parameter model for passing parameters and things from one component to another. They've recently implemented some inheritance to some variables so you can go beyond just a parent talking to a child, but you could set something like a theme at the root of your application, and that will be available to all components regardless of where they live in the tree. This is context in React, inject in Vue. I don't know of an equivalent in Angular. This is very useful for things like tabs inside of a tab set and grids within a grid. Just that kind of components that have to have subcomponents talk to each other. It enables a lot of those kinds of scenarios. And then, as I mentioned before, yeah, the next releases, some of the stuff they're doing is moving everything from the existing, all the component kind of things from the existing Blazor repo into ASP.NET Core and incorporating it with the new .NET Core 3.0, which is very intriguing. So then I have I was gonna show a brand new Blazor app. Fantastic. So you just file new project, and you're gonna choose an ASP.NET Core web app, like most. And if you have the Blazor extension installed, then you'll get 3 options in here. Blazor itself just creates the Blazor app, which if you publish will just be basically an index.html that sits in a folder. You can double click that index.html and it'll load everything you want. You could serve it like a static web page. If you just have a folder in the cloud that you serve files from, it'd work like that. Blazor ASP.NET Core hosted is again client-side Blazor, the same way that one would be, but there's an ASP.NET web host that you'd want to run as an app service or something in Azure. And then there's the Blazor server-side Blazor that does the same, but the C# doesn't run on the client at all. It's all .NET Core and runs in the server. We'll just grab the client application. And to start, let's just run the app and take a look at what it looks like, and then we can compare that to the code. It is building. It's not too bad for a first run. Fantastic.
That's how code demo has to start.
Oh, see, it's benign. Okay, so it's very similar to the ASP.NET Core demo page, but they've changed it around a little bit. So it starts with 3 pages that are different endpoints. If we opened up the dev tools, you can see that there's actually no network traffic that happens as we navigate to different pages, but the router changes to those components as you go. And everything here is powered by C#. There's no JavaScript in this application at all. So on the counter, they have a button that when you click it, it increments a number on the screen. And then they have this fetch data component, which pulls in a list of weather forecasts and displays them in a grid. And all that's powered by C#. And we'll look at the code now. Yes, this is just .NET New Blazor, what it comes with out of the box. So they've got a lot of boilerplate here, but the important stuff are these three components, which I have high font size, but you might not be able to see this too much. So this is that counter page that I had shown. So here you can see counter, current count, and then a button that matches these elements right here. And this button has an on-click registered. It looks very similar to JavaScript, but it is binding for C#, and you pass in a C# function for it. So it's actually running this code. We can change this to increment by 2, and then we'll have to stop and restart, but that will count by 2 then. And it's all powered by C#. This is the structure of a typical Razor component in Blazor. It's very, very similar. It is Razor, but a lot of the C# goes into this at functions block. You can define parameters here, logic, all kinds of things. And then this is utilized by the router. You can also dependency inject things into these components, set up base classes, and they actually have, using base classes, they have a component model where you can have a code behind file if you don't like mixing your markup and C# logic like this. That's an option, and I can show that in a second.
You have like calling to external, like pure C# class methods in there?
Absolutely, yeah. You just dependency inject into this using either the inject, there's an inject directive, whatever this is, command, or you can add, it's property injection. Since there's not really a good constructor here, they use property injection for all of that, and you can inject dependencies that way. Excellent, so looking back at my slides for no reason, nope, that's not what we wanted. It should have given me a browser, but I can do it myself. What is this? There, so now our counter should go 2, 4, 6, 8. Hooray! Then let's look at the component model. So if we would like, we can create a new class here. We'll call it counterbase.C# in order to pull this method down. Should be able to pull all those down to it. And this will need to implement Blazor component. And then in here we can inherits counter base. And that should still work, but now we've got separation between our C# and our markup. It doesn't like this. Inherits counter base. Oh, it's gotta be, what? Is inaccessible due to protection. Ah, ha, ha, ha. Thank you. That's the thing let's just public all the things. That should be better, maybe. Or at least protected all the things. Thank you. And now this should work if I did it right. SDS, I definitely messed that up in a different way. So yeah, that is definitely something on the frequently asked questions that's often requested is to keep those separation of concerns. So I like showing that. Excellent. So there's a bit of boilerplate for Blazor app. They have this method that looks very familiar. If you're using .NET Core anywhere, you can set up all of your dependency injection here just by adding your classes to the services container. Then the app itself, you have to tell it what assembly there is, and they have a comment here saying that that's all temporary. They don't expect this to actually be in the shipping product, but right now you have to tell it the program you are. And it comes with index.html that sets things up. For the most part, all you need is this Blazor WebAssembly.javascript, and then you tell it where the app is. And then that will load that app.cshtml and everything else. They have a view imports that, oh, it's just using statements. I thought it set up, oh, this view import sets up the layout. So you tell it a layout, very similar to MVC or Razor Pages, and the layout is here. It sets up that nav menu, and then ultimately has a body, I believe. Yeah, so that body is set up with the nav menu controls the left nav, and the routing component is set up here with these navlink classes to change your URL to the thing that you're asking for. And I believe these are set up. And then once the URL matches the /counter, this counter page will display, because inside the component it tells the app that I respond to the counter URL. So that's how you can link together things and navigate. So if you need to create a new page, you just copy one of these or create a new directive and then add whatever endpoint you want to listen to. All that's done without any kind of network communication. It's just done through the client side. This fetch data component actually is pulling data from the server, it looks like. And this is showing how they do the dependency injection to take in an HTTP client. And then this is showing it gets some JSON from the server for the weather forecast, populates it into a property on the thing, and then there's a for each in here to display all that data that pulls down from the server inside a table. And the funny thing is there's no server side to this app because we asked for just the client side Blazor. So this is actually just pulling data from a JSON file that's static inside the www root. So there's a sample data, and then weather.json is always freezing on May 6th, and on and on and on. But that could be hitting an API endpoint on your server if you pulled down a different version of the Blazor starting app. Survey prompt shows how to pass a parameter in. So on the main layout, nope, not on the main layout. On the index page, they show an example of that. You can have a subcomponent inside of your component and pass in parameters like this. So the title is How is Blazor Working for You? Once you go into the survey prompt, you can see they take that in as a parameter. You just put this declaration on there, and then it will populate that with the value. And it uses it inside its markup.
Does Visual Studio allow you to navigate the survey prompt?
That is a good question. The Turbay,
Navigate to it or somehow?
looks like the tooling's not there yet. I would imagine it's planned, and it could very well. Oh no, I don't have ReSharper turned on. ReSharper screws all this stuff up with preview things like this, so I would normally blame it, but.
I read an article say that they were looking to add a lot of that tooling into 2019.
Absolutely, I expect a lot of that to get better, and yeah, they're at a weird turning point where they have a new version of their IDE coming out, so they're probably saving some of it for there. Excellent. So that is a very simple application built in Blazor. Then I can direct you to an application I've built. So I've got this app hosted at blazor.jschafer.net if you're interested in looking at it at your phones or whatnot. It's just a simple kind of, what was I going to, horoscope kind of application. So you put some basic information for yourself, and it will generate a little character for you. This is, so there's a few different apps here. I'll drill into the simpler version of this. So this is just the app running on the client-side Blazor. You would type in your name, birth date, and favorite food. or whatever you would like to put in here. This gets serialized into JSON and then hashed, and the hash it spits out is used to show some random statistics about some character you might be. So it just comes up with some things. It's just doing some work in C# to just show something. So there's not much to the app. It's very, very simple. Much of this is C#. The interesting thing I tried to do is build this app twice, once with client-side Blazor and once with the server side, and then set up this application that can run both at the same time to compare some statistics between the two. So this is an application with 2 frames in it, and inside those frames it's running the client side and the server side, and it tracks things like how long it took to load the application on the client versus the server. It should be significantly lower in the server version because it's not pulling down all that C# DLLs and things like that. And then when you put the details of whatever you want to type in, you put it into this form up at the top, and there's logic between the parent application and those child applications to actually fill those things in as you type up here and tab away. It updates inside of those. That was weird. And then you can generate your character, and it similarly generates on both the applications and again tracks the time. So for whatever reason, it took 0.2 seconds to generate it on the server side, and the client side took 2.3 seconds, which seems a little odd because I would assume the client didn't need to make any hops, but I could have screwed something up. But ultimately, it was built to show the differences between the two. And the experiment, I was curious about what the results would be myself. It kind of confirmed my theories that I like the server version of Blazor a bit better, at least where it is right now in its maturity. Being able to just use .NET Core and focus on that, and it's got a very rich debugging experience, is very nice. And the things I'm looking to build, not so heavily reliant on be offline capable or really concerned about like bandwidth to a server. So yeah.
I've heard that the server side is doing a diff between the content rendered on the server and what's currently on the client, and then downloading a binary diff, and that's the way it works.
Yeah, I believe so. I haven't needed to look too deeply into the packet, but yeah, it's very, very fast. I don't think it's sending the entire DOM every time you click a button or anything. It's exactly. It's very, very nice. No, there's no WebAssembly in the server-side version. The server-side is just JavaScript from Microsoft, grabs your change event, and then sends it up to the server. They figure out what needs to happen to the DOM on the client, and they send those changes back down, and it updates. To enable this, you need to make sure you're doing all of your JavaScript interactions asynchronous. Because there is JavaScript in these applications, all of this, surprisingly, nobody's built a library for Blazor to interact with frames yet, iframes. I don't know why. So I had to do all that myself in JavaScript, and then do the JavaScript interop to get those events and changes back to C#. But as long as you're using async in all of your invoke JavaScript stuff, it'll work the exact same on the client and on the server. You just can't synchronously have your C# call JavaScript unless you're on the client, because that doesn't make any sense in a server application. There's going to be a callback in there that's necessary. Nope, it's still web standards. A lot of people have asked for that, like XAML and things that they like in their C# desktop apps. They're very focused on HTML and CSS, at least for now. I think that is likely something that could come of this. You're running C# in the browser. I'd imagine there'd be some way to get another rendering engine in. Oh, okay.
Two projects that are doing.
What are they called?
One's called Uno and one's called, it starts with O.
Uno?
Uno was one. There's two XAML projects that are doing the same thing in WebAssembly.
Like
Excellent.
Canvas or something?
Sorry?
Like through a Canvas element or something?
It's definitely something worth looking at, but I don't know XAML. I'm a web guy, so I haven't checked it out. So we can look at the code for that, at least a little bit, some examples. Recent projects. It's all up on GitHub. On that page, there's a link, and we can send out a link later if you guys are curious about looking at a C# application using Blazor that's somewhat sophisticated at least. It's a little intimidating to look at how many projects there are, but I just tried to keep things as dry as possible. So for that client or child application, there's actually 3 projects, a common place where most of the things live, and then the server and the client implementations. And I was going to show you the difference between server and client app. So there's very little. One of the main things is how you ask for the JavaScript for your page. So on the server, Blazor provides 2 different JavaScript files that turn things on. There's a blazor.server.js and a Blazor, I don't know if it's client, or let's look at what the other name is. Just blazor.webassembly.js. So you need to ask for a different JavaScript file, depending on if you're server side or client side. And then the other change that you need to make is when you use Blazor. For the client side, it's app.useBlazor, and the server side, I think there's a use server-side Blazor. And that's the way things are named right now. I wouldn't be surprised if that changes. Especially server-side Blazor, they're giving the moniker of Razor components. So I'd expect that to change in the next preview. But those 2 lines of code are the only difference between the client side and the server side. So it's very simple to change those out as you need. I did all the JavaScript through middleware just to make sure that the bulk of my application is in this common folder, and inside there, I just ask for a generic blazor.js, and I serve the right file depending on which application it is.
So when you package up all that code, put on the server,
Mm-hmm.
what does it look like? How many files is it? Is it just one DLL, or is it?
So yes. So the www root gets just put out there just like normal. And however many JavaScript files you have will be out on the server. But all the C#, yeah, it gets compiled into a DLL. I think it gets compiled into 2 because they put Razor into its own file. I might be wrong on that. And then, yeah, it's just one download. And all the dependencies are also downloaded along with it. But if you're using the intermediate language linker, it'll reduce the size of the...
And Mono goes down first?
Yes, it's got the first thing is this blazor.webassembly.js, and then yeah, it'll pull down whatever it needs for Mono, and then all the DLLs you're referencing. We can look at the web tools. So let's look at the client again, F12. We'll try F12 one more time, and give it a refresh. And I think I can zoom in okay on this. So, it starts with blazor.js. This is a file that I provided, I think, foundation.js. Yeah, that's mine. But then Mono is definitely not. There's a Mono JavaScript file, a Mono WebAssembly file, and then all kinds of DLLs. So it starts with my application and then grabs all the dependencies that it has. And whoa, there's a fair amount. 17 megs currently for this app.
Down every time you load the page.
It'll have the same kind of browser caching that you typically have in web apps, so it'll be a very expensive first-time download for a web page. That 17 megs is pretty big, but then hopefully, especially if you're an intranet app or something, that'll be cached and you should be good for subsequent access. Until you make an update on the server and then everyone's downloading it all again. Yeah, hopefully the Mono stuff is static. Absolutely. I think, I was going to show some. So I have some JavaScript here that sets up things for calling the server. So no, that's not as good to show as the server part of that. I apologize. 1 second. Status report sender. So this is a C# class that sends a status report, so that area where I was showing the number of seconds that it took to load the application, this is utilized for that. And here is where we're calling some JavaScript. Okay, this was not quite what I had expected. But this is calling a status report sender.send function and passing the status report down. Inside of that site.js, I have I need to click better. Everything needs to be in the global namespace. I assume if you're trying to access things in Angular or something that's really good at namespacing and keeping your JavaScript modular, it may be problematic for something like Blazor. But that I have a window.statusreportsender.send that accepts that, and then it calls a parent application manager function that I think is another thing. But ultimately, the JavaScript can talk back to the server too. You just need to either provide a reference to the .NET class that you're using through this, or you can call static methods in C#, just like you can call global methods in JavaScript. It's got to be global in nature or have some reference to the thing that you want. I believe if I look at a page next, status report sender. So here's a way to pass a .NET object to JavaScript. You just wrap it in a .NET object ref, and then when JavaScript gets there, you can just call C# methods on this thing. So whatever you name that variable that you just gave to the JavaScript, you can call .start, .send, whatever functions you have on that instance of the object. And the Blazor handles all the magic between it for your JavaScript being able to call instance methods in the .NET object. All in all, I definitely enjoyed using this framework to build this application. I already have plans for my next app to build. The talk at SDS, I actually had another app that might be interesting to show for a second. You can hit it at blazor-game.jschafer.net. It was a little problematic because I was trying to do real-time things, and I was just trying to do too much with it. So the new app is a little simpler to show, but this is a 4-in-a-row kind of game that definitely has no errors. Okay. I might get it working someday again. But it has all kinds of SignalR things, and it's a little game that you can play. I'm definitely loving Blazor, and I hope you guys do too. Any questions?
I'm not seeing the difference between server-side Blazor and Blazor.
The key thing is it is a first class to embracing single-page application. It's still doing the postback kind of stuff, but if you're building MVC, typically you're going to pull in an Angular or a React or something to enable the single-page app feel if that's a priority for you. This is the first thing that's C# based that you can get that same application feel without having to resort to Ajax or something to try and mimic it. I think the component model is fairly compelling, and there are definitely some differences. There's no controller, and it's even fairly different from Razor Pages, where you're still dealing with navigation and postbacks and things, and gets, puts, posts.
You're not downloading the HTML app, you're doing this diff. They've got something on the client that can understand the diff that comes down. It's very different.
Mm-hmm.
Is there a reason to use like a React or something in addition?
I would think not. I think you'd run into just a lot of problems of trying to understand when to use the React features versus the C# features. In the stuff I did, I had Bootstrap, and I used some Bootstrap components and things, but I think you'd lean more towards that, pulling in something to provide maybe a grid or something, jQuery grid or the Kendo controls.
Are you just using native JS in this?
Yes, I didn't do TypeScript or anything. That would also be interesting because if I was going to do that, I'd start introducing NPM and then you've got a whole other mess of things. But it wouldn't be too bad, I imagine. The hope is as more and more community-driven things come along to build Blazor components, you'll need less and less JavaScript in your own app. Hopefully, we're not too far from realistic ability to build a web app completely in C# without needing to resort to JavaScript at all.
If you wanted to share one of your Blazor components, would you just like put a DLL on like NPM or something?
They do have the concept of a Blazor library. I have one of those here that I experimented a little bit with. So you can tell it it's an output library, and there's some Blazor things here, but for the most part, it's not. There's a little bit of magic in here, if I remember. Inside of a Blazor library, if you have a content folder and then some JavaScript, it handles embedding the download script in the Blazor application for you. So you can create a library here that relies on JavaScript, and the consumer of your Blazor library never needs to put anywhere using foundation.js. That just happens for them when they pull in this library. I'm pulling this one in from a project reference, but presumably it'd do the same thing on NuGet. And it's very nice. You just build pages just like anything else, and then you can consume those pages from the referencing application. Yeah, I was very impressed with the JavaScript and C# aspect of that, or CSS aspect of that, that it just worked without needing problem, or needing to implement in some way. Or even, yeah. I think you do need to pull in these components in your application that consumes them, very similar to a tag helper. It might even be the same, I keep saying directive, but I don't remember what it is. But yeah, this statement pulls in the components from the child thing, which I assume is just because they didn't have time to set up a new command. But yeah, it's very interesting.
So is it Razor components or Blazor components?
Razor components.
So for Razor components, what do you send down first that does that diffing?
There's that JavaScript file that it handles. Yeah, that's all you do is that using script tag for the blazor.serverside.js, and then it asks the server for what am I supposed to put inside this app directive or this app tag, and then it starts sending things down and doing those diffs. It works surprisingly well for how sophisticated that whole system needs to be. Yeah, and I'm very curious how much the server knows, because like if you get, like, what kind of state is it using? I need to look into that more. If you're trying to hit like really high loads, if it's maintaining state of what every client is currently set to and doing those diffs, that may be expensive. But I didn't test anything like that with this app. That would also be interesting to look at the memory footprint of the server if you're comparing these two examples. I might do that later.
You would have to re-render. I mean, if you didn't want to keep state, you just have to re-render and then do the diff.
Yeah, exactly. Like, yeah.
I think you had some of those types of issues when we had, on your previous talk, when you did the Connect Full game through Signal R, where we had a lot of, everyone was trying to manage their own game, but since everybody was hitting basically the same server, posting all those things, you've got very different results.
Indeed.
On each client.
Mm-hmm. I think that was mostly due to my trying to manage state, and I screwed it up. But hopefully Microsoft's better at it than me. Excellent. Any other questions? All right. Thank you guys very, very much.